get into Torah, it's like, how do you choose your favorite part? And for me, the Constitution is really one of my favorite parts because it teaches us how to live, and it gives us so many good values and information. So tonight we are looking at the legislature, and I'm actually going to take this slow. I had a very busy week, so I didn't get too far into this, and this may be a good thing because it allows us to explore things a little bit more in depth. You know, when Israel came before Samuel, and they asked Samuel for a king, they asked Yahweh for a king, God told them that they were rejecting him for all the nation, for a king like all the nations of the earth. The implication in every way is that the kingship, the monarchy, was an inferior way. It was not, it didn't provide the liberty, didn't provide the public, what's what I'm looking for, did not allow the public voice as strongly as what the judges system did. Now, we tend to look at the judges system where every man did what was right in his own eyes, and you know, they didn't have a whole lot of cohesions. They were very a loose tribal federation, and we kind of see that as inferior. But the question is, was it? One of the scholars on the Hyksos, this would have been the people who exited out of Egypt somewhere between 1550 and 1530, and I posit that these are one and the same people. They may not be equated exactly, but for all intents and purposes, the Hyksos were the Israelites. And one thing that we find during this 150, 200 year period of Hyksos rule in Egypt, each of their leaders ruled over Egypt for a period of about 2 to 4 years before they were replaced by another leader. There's strong indication, and Don Van Setters actually posits the fact that these leaders were probably elected when they served their term, and then when their election, they could only serve one term, because we don't ever find them serving more than one term at any point of records in the King's List or any of the lists that we have from Egypt. So when we transfer to the Judges era, there is a very strong association that indicates this system continued for about 430 years during that Judges period. So what did it look like? We tend to think, just because I think so much emphasis has been given to it religiously mainly within Judaism, because you don't find the emphasis within Christianity. Christianity has really lost the constitutional basis of the Torah. But within Judaism, you find a lot of emphasis, of course, on the king, sons of David, and the Levites, the Kohen. But just find that they totally overlook, it's like they totally skip the importance and the role of the Adah in Israel's legislative and decision-making process for their society. So we're going to look at some of these tonight. So if you guys do have a book, we are going to begin on page 258 with the Legislative Assembly, and we're going to look at the Adah. One of the first instances, the first situations that we come across is right before Israel is about to enter the land. You have these people that come before Joshua and the elders of Israel with their clothes torn, their bread is old and crusty, and they say, we came from this faraway nation and we want to make a peace treaty with you because we've heard what you've done to Agag and to all of these kings of the earth, and we seek your mercy. We will become your servants. You know, just let us live. So Joshua and the princess, which in Hebrew that term is Nazi, the princes of the land, made a covenant with them. And they made this contract, a treaty. Today we would call a covenant a treaty with the Gibeonites, and said, yes, you can live. You know, you're way in the borders of our land. You know, you're really not even a concern right now. But what's fascinating in this story, and let's read it. I'm going to read Joshua 9, and we're just going to look at verses 15 and 18. So then Joshua made peace with them and made a league with them to let them live. And the princes of the congregation, and the word there for congregation is adopt, swore to them. And the children of Israel smote them not, because the princes of the congregation had sworn to them by Yahweh, God of Israel. And the congregation, the Adah, murmured against the princes. Now, this is very interesting because you have the Nazi of the Adah. So you kind of have a dual system, a dual body, where you have the Nazi, the princesses themselves, that are kind of a decision-making body, and they obviously had more say-so. They had a greater voice in these negotiation processes than what the rest of the Adah did, because it was the voice of the princes that prevailed. And you find that the lay Adah murmured. They complained about what these princes and leaders of the people, the decision that they had made, and that Joshua had gone along with it, that he agreed with it. Of course, we know in the story that later on, the people, the princesses, Joshua, everyone discovers that the Gibeonites are actually a people of the land. They do not live that far. They are within the territory that Israel is going to be conquering within the first 5 to 20 years on the land. So Israel says, okay, you deceived us. We made this treaty with you in good faith. We will honor it because, as you know in Torah, it says whether you agree to something, whether it be good or whether it be evil, you still must uphold that word. We also find that in the case of Saul, where he reneges on a covenant that he made, that Yahweh holds him and his sons accountable to that. He does not forego it just because the word was given and a treaty was reached. He doesn't let them renege on it just because there's a new leader or because the political situation has changed. Rather, what God encourages is for people to consider to consider the merits of the treaty and to judge wisely in the first place, and to follow in the first place, rather than having to do the two-step and make it up somewhere along the way. So you find here, and this is kind of one of our first indications of this Adah, this decision-making, and we will see later, it is a legislative body. But within this Adah, you have the Nazi. I tend to compare the Nazi as what we would see in Great Britain as the House of Lords, and then the Adah as the House of Commons. In the United States, we could make a very general comparison to perhaps the Senate and the Congress as two ruling, or not ruling, but two functioning houses in the decision-making process for both the domestic and foreign matters. Now, you find that in ancient times, today we have the luxury, and I do use the word luxury, of having very firmly and very strictly delineated systems and functions of government. That is really a blessing, a positive consequence of our prosperity that we have enjoyed. Of prosperity that we enjoy because we have technology, because we have evolved, because we have progressed as a society. You find that Europe, they did not begin to embrace loosely democratic ideas where the people had some sort of voice. You don't find any of those ideas, any of those revolutions of enlightenment within British society until a certain amount of manual labor, based, sustenance labor, whether it be food or, sort of distribution of food in that realm, has been taken care of, so that you can have people in society that can pursue greater enlightenment and pursue law and justice and social endeavors. So today, our ability to have very strongly delineated and very strong separated branches of government is still a blessing from the prosperity that we enjoy. If your entire society is just based focusing on sustenance every day, you really are not going to have that much time for legislative processes. So you find for Israel that the Adah not only, and this is some sort of very loosely functioning Congress, they not only decide in political matters and foreign policy, they also make decisions in court cases. And turn, if you will, to Numbers 35:24. It says, then the congregation, Adah, or not, the Adah here, shall judge between the slayer and the revenger of blood according to these judgments. The congregation, the Adah, shall deliver the slayer out of the hand of the revenger of blood. Notice here that the congregation was to be the stopgap, a protection for the person who had been accused. The revenger is not allowed to come and just exact revenge, exact punishment, or anything until a court can convene, until a jury can convene. So there is a protection here that is afforded to the manslayer or to the murderer. And we know from other parts in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that the murderer is afforded the protection of a refuge city. He is encouraged to seek to a refuge city. He is given asylum, and he is afforded protection by the priesthood of that city. Today, say even a few years ago, 100 years ago, it would be very akin, very similar to what you find when people would flee to a monastery and they would seek asylum within a monastery, and the king of the land or the ruling monarch, whoever it would be, really could not touch them as long as they were within that monastery, because you had a rivalry political faction that stood up for the indigent, the oppressed, and the accused. Now, in Israel's government, in Israel's society, he was protected until such time as he was brought to trial. And we find that if you continue in Numbers 35:25, it says, the Adah shall restore him to the city of refuge, where he was fled, and he shall abide in it until the death of the high priest, which was anointed with holy oil. Now, this judgment is in direct situation to where a murderer has not been convicted. If he has been convicted of murder, and especially if it is premeditated murder, then he is put to death. If it is not premeditated murder, maybe it was involuntary manslaughter, maybe he was cutting down a tree and the tree fell on someone, or maybe he was driving a car and he kills someone accidentally. This allowed the manslayer, the involuntary manslaughter charge, the person who was accused of that, the defendant, to abide in the city until the high priest's death. But notice, it is the congregation, it is the Adah that judges in these situations. The Adah are expected to have a firm grasp of the law. They are expected to have a firm understanding of the law. So you find that these branches of government, in fact, do intersect, and they do cross over simply because these were functions that not everyone in Israel's society may be able to fulfill if they are not well educated. You also find that Israel's Adah, their assemblies, are preordained. A lot of people, and this is, the way I used to approach the holy days, was that you had your 3 annual holy days, and that they were religious affairs, and that they were religious holidays. Not quite sure what you did other than offer sacrifices or burnt offerings, but there was some sort of religiosity associated with it. And I'm sure that was part of it. I'm sure you probably had some sort of singing and dancing and great celebrations. But you're going to find that as we continue our study tonight, that these legislative assemblies were preordained with the nation's 3 annual feast days, the 3 annual Chags. So you find that the term Adah is derived from the root Yad. And Stephen, correct me if I'm pronouncing it. I do still speak Southern Hebrew. so my pronunciation may be incorrect. But you find the implication there is that the Adah is to convene at appointed times. So they have a very specific function for Israel's, as Israel's governing body. You also find that their ability to vote in Israel's legislative assembly is not guaranteed. Their voting rights are guaranteed by their standing, by their status as an upright citizen within Israel's congregation. They had to be law-abiding citizens. Had they committed adultery, had they been accused of a crime, had they committed theft, or anything, you blaspheme the name of Yahweh, any of these things disallowed them from being part of this decision-making process, and their voice was then no longer heard within that governing body. And we're going to look at that process a little bit next week, because we're just not going to have time to get into it tonight. So the other thing that you find is that the Adah really judged between the murderer and his victim. Now, what happens if the case was too hard? We know that in every case where a decision was difficult, it was always appealed to the Levites and ultimately to the high priest, who would take the case, go into the temple or tabernacle or temple, bring it before Yahweh, and allow God himself to issue some sort of judgment in a case. The other requirement for being a member of this Adah, this Congress, is that you had to be a part of an active militia. And this militia had several purposes. Number one, they had to carry out or enforce a judge's sentence. So if it was putting someone to death, the Adah had to carry that out. If it was, rallying the troops with going to war, that also fell within their jurisdiction. But it's very interesting. And let's turn with me to Leviticus 24:14. And here it states, it says, "Bring forth him that is cursed without the camp, and let all him that hurt him lay their hands upon his head. Let all the Adah stone him." We have here a very strong system of accountability, where if you pass a death sentence on someone, you don't pass that death sentence and then have somebody else carry it out. If you pass that death sentence, then you actually have to be the one to enforce it. You have to do your own dirty work. This provides a lot of accountability. And I don't think that we can fully appreciate the politics involved with it, because just think of what happens if you have a convening of Congress. And really, this is more of a judicial body. It's more of a jury. And what happens if this jury passes sentence on someone and they put them to death, and later some disturbing evidence is found? Maybe the person is innocently accused. Maybe one or two members of the governing body were in cahoots with and set the defendant up, and he was innocent, and yet he was put to death. That is going to have a lot of political backlash, where the people are going to become very angry. There's going to be a lot of resentment, because you didn't just erroneously pass this, you actually put this person to death. And because you put this person to death, you are held accountable, and then your life goes for life. So there was a lot of systems of accountability that were interwoven and really layered one upon the other. You also find that the Adah had charge with military matters. So if they were going to go to war, if they were going to declare war, or say have a campaign into a territory, they had to vote for it. And when they voted in favor of a military campaign, they weren't sending somebody else's kids into the battlefront. They were going into the battlefront. Their children were going into the battlefront. Very, very similar to what you see in the state of Israel today, where every member of society is part of the army at some point in time. They serve as one of the branches of government. Ancient Israel would have worked the same way. Now, there was anciently a ban on women in the military. Whether or not that will be something that is imposed at the Restoration is yet to be determined. And anciently, there was the ban on women in the military, which would preclude her also then from taking an active role in the Congress, because it was only military aged men or people who had served in the military that could then be part of the Adah. You find that the Adah was subject to both the Cohen, to the Levites, as well as to the leader of the nation. Now, we find that the leader of the nation during the Judges era, again, I propose that it was an elected position, and they served anywhere between 4 and 20 years. It didn't seem like it was preset by any formula as it had been in Egypt. You find that most of them are about 20 years in length unless they die prematurely or there's some sort of political fallout whereby another leader is elected. You find that the Adah is commanded to carry out whatever the leader has commanded. But as we're going to see in a moment, when the leader oversteps his bounds, you're going to find that it is the Adah that withstands the king. It is the Adah that withstands the king's authority when it is oppressive or when it goes against the Torah Constitution. So the king and the leader, the Israel's Constitution allowed verdicts and contractual agreements by any of the two nations' branches of government. So you could have the leader and the priesthood that would side on a matter. You could have the leader and the Adah that would side on a matter in order for that balance of power to prevail in Israel's society and for there to be some sort of accountability. You also find several situations where the Adah played very important roles. Remember the story of the Benjamites, where they became horribly wicked. You couldn't even pass through their territory without basically being raped or attacked or molested in some way. And so it was the Adah that came against the Benjamites. It's the Adah that was the military force that executed the judgment that had been pronounced. So you find later on in the case of the altar of Ed, there had been a charge made against Manasseh. I believe it was Manasseh. I did not put this in my notes. It's been a while since I've read the story. But they had accused Manasseh for committing adultery and erecting an altar. Now, in the law, it says that the only place you can have a standing altar and bring your offering is specifically at the tabernacle. At this point in time, it would have been in Shiloh. So you were to bring your offerings to Shiloh and really no other place. But you find that they had erected this altar and the rumors had spread throughout the tribes, and you have Eliezer, the high priest, and the Adah siding together, going with their armed forces to reestablish the law, in order to tear this altar down and to make sure that the nation is in covenant, as in contract with the Torah. So you find that there is this system of accountability. You find that Joshua in this situation does not take an active role. He is laid back simply because this is a matter of religion. It is a matter of religion of God. It's not a military matter where Joshua would have had a greater voice and greater leadership. In this case, because it has to do with covenant, it has to do with constitution and obedience, this is the Levites' role, and this is why you see the high priest leading the situation. You also find that you know, it is the Levite that installs the monarch, simply because, of course, the leaders can't install themselves. So it is the Levite that installs the monarchy. But you also find throughout Israel's history that when the monarch oversteps his boundaries, that he will often side, or the Adah will often side with him to overthrow the sons of David. Now, it's not like they just totally overthrow the sons of David, but they are overthrowing a very particular monarch who has overstepped his bounds and who is oppressing the people. He is really bringing Israel away from everything that the freedom the covenant had granted to them. So let me give you some specific instances. You have the situation where Rehoboam, where there is a convening of the tribes in Jerusalem. Solomon, of course, has passed away. Rehoboam has already been established. He's reigned for maybe a year or two. I believe, let's look this up real quick, because at the time of Rehoboam's inauguration, he had actually only been a monarch for a couple years before the release year convened. And I do show, when we get into chapter 9, I present evidence showing that Israel actually did convene either at Shiloh or at Jerusalem every 7 years throughout most of the Judges period, and off and on during the monarchy. You find that they convened, that they assembled, and that they made decisions for the nation during these times. So you find that was 960. Okay, so 944. It's fascinating because Rehoboam was actually installed over Jerusalem and over Judah, Israel, for maybe a few weeks, a few months. We really don't know, simply because of the way that the scribes reckon time and the way that they reckon the reigns of the monarchs. But you find that Rehoboam is officially installed during a release year. The significance of this is that Israel would naturally convene in Jerusalem to renew the covenant, but also to decide in the affairs of the nation. And in 944, when Rehoboam was installed, the nation had a very important decision to make, and that is, would they continue following the sons of David? Solomon's reign, for all of its might and glory and peace, was not the best for the people. It was highly oppressive for the people. It talks about excessive taxation, a corvée labor force that was really conscripted from Israel's enemies, but it affected Israel's citizens nonetheless. You find that Rehoboam says, my father chastised you with scorpions, for me, or with whips, I will be scorpions. So it's going to be much worse under me. So he gave them a very harsh answer. And with this, it is the Adah that decide to separate from Rehoboam. You also find that David's throne is usurped by Ahab's daughter, Athaliah, and she reigns over Judah for a period of 6 years. At the end of 6 years, it is the Adah that sides with the priesthood, overthrows Athaliah, has her trampled in the gate, and then installs Josiah as monarch. And what's fascinating is, I'm sorry, Joash, not Josiah. It's easy to mix the two up. So you find that when he is installed, when little Joash is installed, he is installed with the written Constitution in his hand, so that he will know this is his rule and this is his law for governing. This is what he is committing to in accepting the leadership role, the shepherding role for Yahweh's people. And we find that these three branches of government, the monarchy, the Levites, which is more of a Supreme Court, an interpretation of the Constitution Torah, and the Adah, a lower legislative body and a legislative making assembly, you find that God really views these equally. And let me give you an example. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with Jeremiah. And this is Jeremiah 30, verses 20 through 21. And let me read this to you. It says, "Thus saith Yahweh, if you can break my covenant of the day and my covenant of the night, that they should not be day or night in their seasons, then may also my covenant be broken with David my servant, that he should not have a son to reign on his throne, and with the Levites, the priests, my ministers." So what God is actually saying here is that it's like an eternal a caste system where forever a son of David or a son of Levi, and we know later in history that they also have to pass through the house of Zadok, that these two houses will forever have some sort of leadership role in governing Israel. It says, "Consider you not that this people has spoken and said, the two families Yahweh has chosen, has he not cast them off? Thus they have despised my people, that they should be no more a nation before them. Thus saith Yahweh, if my covenant be not with the day and night, and if I have not appointed the ordinances of heaven and earth, then will I cast away the seed of Jacob, and David my servant, so that I will not take any of his seed to be rulers over the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For I will turn their captivity, and I will have mercy on them." So again, this is reiterating the promise that the sons of David and the sons of Levi will once again be established in leadership roles when Israel is reestablished on the land. But we often forget, we often overlook the continuation of this verse. It's not just Levi and Judah. It's not just the Supreme Court and the monarchy that are reestablished. Look at what else is established. Look at Jeremiah 30, verse 20. "Their children also shall be as before time, and their congregation, the Adah, shall be established before me, and I will punish all those that oppress them." So we have the idea that this Adah, this legislative body, will once again be reestablished at a future time of restoration. So this is incredible when you see so many of the ideas that we find work well, the values that work well, the systems that work well in American society and in American government. Most scholars, most theologians tend to think of those ideas as really coming from the Roman Republic. But this almost sets up the question of how much influence, or how much just through trade and through just coming in contact with different societies, how much of this ancient system perhaps may have influenced Rome and some of the values and some of the systems of government that Rome later established some 1,500 years later. Now, I mentioned before that Israel had prearranged congressional assemblies, and these were the nation's 3 holy days. God gives a promise, and this is in Exodus 34:23. It says, 3 times in the year shall all your men appear before Yahweh, the God of Israel. Now, again, why is it men? It was men because they were the ones that they were the landowners, which, as we will see next time, was a qualification for membership in the Adah. They served in the military, which was another qualification for the Adah. So to meet all of these qualifications, it was the men that were commanded to assemble. The women were more than welcome and more than encouraged to come, but they were not compelled if there were other responsibilities or other things that the woman had to do. So you find that the that the men came 3 times a year. And the promise for doing this, if you look at this, God says, I will cast the nations out before you. No, I will enlarge your borders, and no one will desire your land. The modern state of Israel can take a lesson from this because perhaps, and I'm not saying that is true, but could you imagine all of Israel's forces, all of their military men, so many of their people just totally descending on Jerusalem and convening on every holy day. Can you imagine perhaps the fear that may be instilled in some of the enemies of Israel, and how maybe some people who want the land, I won't name any names here, but maybe those political factions will not seek the land as they do today. God will turn their heart away so that they will perhaps seek their own land in their own countries, and that they will retreat from wanting something that is not theirs, and even within their own writings is not given to them in their own writing. So the idea also is that by the Adah, also having this militia within their governing body, they were always prepared. They were always ready for whatever would come their way. You also find that this entire system kept Israel very connected to God. It kept, can you imagine the national solidarity that the nation had? You were an actual part of that legislative process. Yes, it did make the legislative process bogged down, but I think having your legislative process bogged down by a sheer number of voting constituents, it's a much better system than having your system bogged down by the bureaucracy that Western nation faces today. The ever-ending paperwork, the ever-ending red tape, the ever-ending, you have to go through this chain of command, and you have to, it just doesn't end. Where, can you imagine the satisfaction that you get when you know that your voice has been heard? Again, don't think we can appreciate the patriotism and the national solidarity and the sense of brotherhood of this family nation that came by every member having a voice and playing a part. Stephen states, he kept anyone from even coveting their land while they came to the festivals. Exactly, that is the promise. No one will covet your land, no one will want your land. And it's fascinating because I did see a Palestinian author recently. This was probably about 3 months ago, and I do not remember his name. But he was coming out and saying that Muhammad never stated that they should occupy Jerusalem for Israel, and that was a much later interpretation. And he was really going against this whole idea that Jerusalem needed to be occupied. He's like, our places are in Mecca and Medina. This is where we need to be. So, it presents some very strong possibilities. If you see a crack in the wall, you see this dam where one voice stands up and where one voice speaks, he may inspire others to speak. And if this becomes a political movement or a view that then pervades the entire religious polity, there's no end to the peace that can be brought by this recognition of Israel's right to the promised land. Stephen points out the best vacation security package ever. Exactly. And Stephen points out that the Quran never even mentions Jerusalem. Very, very good point. A lot of the things that the Quran, and this is deviating from our teaching tonight, a lot of the things that the Quran teaches are not even the words of Muhammad. Sometimes they are the words of his followers, just like the New Testament records the words of the disciples. Now, in Judeo-Christianity, we have this idea that if God said something, his initial words were truth. So that if something comes along later on, whether it be a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, the whole Deuteronomy 13, and I believe it's also 23, that some later person cannot come along and rescind or change a previous word of truth that was spoken. The idea is that if God says something, he knows how natural law works, and whatever he has said is in accordance with natural law. It is right, it is true, so it cannot change and it cannot be rescinded. In the Islamic faith, you have the exact opposite, where the latest thing, like the newest kid on the block, if he makes a new edict or a new decree, the latest thing that Muhammad said goes back and not reinterprets, but it supersedes, or it what's the word I'm looking for? It's a legal term. It displaces or replaces the previous belief, the previous doctrine, or the previous legislation. So that is a very big difference between just even an approach to whether it's judicial interpretation or religious interpretation. It's a very big difference between Islam and Judeo-Christianity. So I am going to kind of cut things a little bit short tonight, simply because I had a very busy week and I did not have time to get into the rest of the chapter. Next week we're going to continue this, and we are actually going to just continue on through page, let me give you the page that we're going to end with, 274. So we will continue through page 274. But I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. Now, tomorrow I am teaching at Roots of Faith. I hope you all will join me. I am going to be doing a study, kind of a little bit of an interactive study teaching, where we're going to just go over the basics of how to study the Tanakh, how to study Scripture, and how it's so easy to just place it in your hands and decide for yourself. Not decide for yourselves, but base your faith, base your beliefs on facts and evidence, and not just on emotions, not just on wishful thinking, and not just on what your neighbor may believe or a group of people may believe. You know, just because the group does it doesn't make it right, doesn't make it something that's sanctioned by God. So we really have to come back and make it line upon line and precept upon precept, so that we are not deceived by false precept. So any questions, guys? I'm just going to open this up. And Stephen, I see that you've posted a lot of good information on the Hebrew. I do appreciate that. And so glad you could make it, Keith. Great to see you. And Jeff and Cindy and Sylvia and Betty, just glad everyone could make it. Raylene, so glad everyone is here. So any questions or comments, please go ahead and post. And I do hope you guys will join me in the morning. It's going to be lots of fun. I hope to give you guys lots of tools that you can put into work for yourself. Cindy says, great points to discuss. Too many are being tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine and lack understanding history and context. That is so true. Context is really everything. And understanding that how ancient Israel would have understood it in their day and their age. We are blessed with so many inscriptions, that whether it's from Ugarit, whether it's from Amarna, whether it is from Mesopotamia, that really grant a context to a lot of the language as well as the rituals. One of the things that I do point out in my book is that Israel was not alone in keeping these 3 annual feasts. We have reference in Ugarit text of what is called a Feast of Huts. So whether that was Israelites within the Ugaritic society, or whether that was a custom that had been given with the Noahic covenant, and it fell into disuse. It was displaced by other religious systems as they evolved. We really don't know. We do have a pretty good idea that Noah had probably a good portion of the Torah, simply because the Hammurabi Code does contain some wording and some similarities, although it diverges in some very specific points, which I believe we discussed about 3 or 4 classes ago. But there is this foundation of accountability that is laid out in the Noahic covenant. And you find that all societies at one point in time may have kept the holy days. We have evidence from Mesopotamia of a spring and fall holy day, a Passover, as well as a Sukkot. So Israel was not necessarily alone in this, but we find that other nations had really fallen away from the the legislative as well as the covenant that God had established with humanity. And they had totally replaced their systems of government with a two-party system, being a monarch and a priesthood, and you really had no voice outside of that. Those were really the two parties, and you find whether it's in Egypt or Mesopotamia, that often you'd have competing priesthoods that were kind of like little city-states, but over time the monarchy and the priesthood would unite together with one particular faction. So maybe it would be the cult of Isis that would unite with a pharaoh, or maybe it would be the cult of Osmerabda that would unite with the king in Mesopotamia. And you find that then that became the powerful faction, and there was no way for the citizens to withstand that powerful authority and that ruling house. So with Israel, God reestablishes the idea of no, you can't just make your own legislation. You can't just go and do anything that you want, make your own laws. Any law that is going to be made, any judgment that's going to be made in judicial matters will always be based upon these precepts, upon these principles, so that you can have peace and tranquility in your society, and that can eventually be spread to other societies. Now, a question, now this is Raylene, I believe, says, how are the Adah different from the Kahal? That is a great question. And we are going to get into that next week. I wanted to get into that this week, but I didn't quite have time to prep for it because I was very, very busy getting my kids into college. I now have 3 in college, so I was busy taking care of that and just didn't have the time. I will say that, you know, one of the things that you find when you're working with ancient languages is that sometimes the language does change over time, and we will see where the term Kahal meant one thing in Moses' day and another thing by the time we get to Ezra's day. Words fall out of use, they are displaced and replaced, and we're going to find that as we study the differences between the Kahal and the Adah next week. Sherry says, Adam, Shavah, Cain, and Abel knew how to sacrifice from the beginning because Yahweh rejected Cain's sacrifice. Very, very good point, Sherry. You know, the Septuagint states that God rejected Cain's sacrifice simply because he did not divide it properly. And the idea there is that he did not give God a fair share. He really kind of selfishly divided it, where he kept most to himself and gave a very small portion for God. That is the implication. And by that, you find that God then says, be careful because sin lies at the door of your heart, and guard against it because simply because you open the door for greater things. You know, once you depart, once you give ear to that selfishness, you really don't know where you're going. Unless you have that self-discipline, you're just going to be on that slippery slope. Cindy says, so true about words evolving. Just like, yes, gay today means something totally different than gay meaning happy in the early 1900s. Exactly. And I am actually going to get into some of these ideas tomorrow in the How to Study Scripture class. You know, this is a class I hope everyone can attend, because it is a way whereby you can hold accountable anybody who comes and says, hey, I studied Scripture, let me share that with you, or they say, come follow me. I don't care what name they put to their movement or to whatever they do. There are a few simple, they're not tricks, they're tools you can use to hold anyone accountable, to go and look it up. If they make a claim, I'm going to show you how you can, within 5 minutes, look it up and see if they are legit or if they're smoking some hot air, and you just need to walk the other way and say, hey, this just really isn't for me. So I hope you guys will attend. It's going to be a lot of fun. Any other questions or comments? So you know, guys, I really enjoy talking with you all and visiting. This to me is just the highlight of my Friday evening. And we've become kind of a community of people. It's really a lot of fun. So now, how was the video? I'm seeing on my end that it's kind of blurry tonight. I'm not sure if that's because I'm broadcasting from Roots of Faith. I see one that's a real good quality HDMI and another one that's a less quality. So I'm not sure how this will do on the rebroadcast. So any other questions or comments? All right. All right. If there's no other, I'm going to go ahead and shut the room down. Have a wonderful evening. And I am also, let me tell you guys this too. I'm going to be doing a series this next week, or a series, or at least one or two broadcasts with Talking Torah, with Jeff from Talking Torah. So be looking for that. And I'm also going to be having a blog post this week. So be looking for that too. I hope you guys will enjoy it. So Shabbat Shalom, and I hope you have a peaceful, restful Sabbath. And we have one more day till the end of the week officially, and hopefully it will be a peaceful day and a blessing for everyone. So Shabbat Shalom.